say to the people that may be watching right now that are saying, you know what, factories in Detroit are closing, General Motors they're cutting shifts? What do you say to those people that arguably you're hurting?
Well, I mean, we've been hurting for 2.5 years. It's the 4th day. What's 4 days to 2.5 years? Please tell me.
The RCMP tactical assault vehicle was brought up to the front of the line. They told people that they had to leave, and then police officers converged from the front and from the rear and pushed the protesters together. They also knocked on the windows of the pickup trucks that were parked in that area. They told the drivers to get out, and then each of the 2 drivers who had refused to leave was arrested. And when they got to the corner where we are, there were some other vehicles, some larger trucks, and those trucks decided that they would leave of their own accord. There were no arrests made here.
Hello and happy Wednesday. Welcome to WJ Live. I am Abby Liebing, a reporter here at the Western Journal, and I'm joined today by Josh Manning, the wonderful deputy managing editor. Big title.
That's me. Wonderful. No one in this organization has ever described me as that.
I'm trying, you know, and the talented Caleb Gina, who is one of our assignment editors.
Guilty as charged.
Yes. So today, as you saw in that clip that we just played for you, we are going to be talking a bit about protest and particularly roping in the Freedom Convoy that has been, well, causing havoc in Canada and now on the northern U.S. border. What we want to particularly talk about today, though, is what the effectiveness of protest and how peaceful protests should be approached, especially in light of the last 2 years, as we have seen the Black Lives Matter riots, extreme destruction after the death of George Floyd breaking out in cities all across the country. And so talking about really at what point do the cost of a protest, even a peaceful protest, start to outweigh the benefits of it? So Josh, I want to hear some of your thoughts, particularly starting out with the Freedom Convoy, because we saw there's been, you know, it's been going on for a while and we're starting to see some really big economic impacts on it, from it, as, you know, border crossings are being closed, trade is being stalled, we're having problems in grocery stores. So what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the fella at the top of the show summed it up really well. The setup question from the reporter was ridiculous. The premise that they were making it hard on manufacturers and suppliers and those people. And the fellow who responded, he nailed it. He said, look, it's been 2.5 years of this for us. It's been 4 days of it for those people. Really? You guys can't take it for 4 days? And I think we can revisit this as we go forward, but I think protesters ought to actually keep that in mind. All it took less than a week of this to bring Canada to its knees to cause Trudeau. How many days in were we when Trudeau fled?
Went to the bunker.
Than one?
Yeah.
I don't think they were even in Ottawa yet.
Yeah.
Right.
So he fled. It took less than 1 day to cause Trudeau to flee, and it took less than a week or two to seemingly, if you believe the press, to bring Canada to its knees. So, if anything, that stupid question from the reporter actually kind of gave away the secret formula for how to do this. Which is just, as Jordan Peterson said, stay the course, fellas.
Yes.
If they do stay the course, then I think it's unbelievably effective. It has galvanized national, it's Canada. It's galvanized our attention better than anything else in as far as COVID goes in the U.S. since this started. I think it's been super effective.
Yeah. Caleb, what do you think staying the course, though, with the Freedom Convoy means? What is the end game, the end result, when they can finally say, all right, we've done it, we're going home?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the Freedom Convoy truckers have done effectively is I think they made their demands very specific. They asked for something. So part of my issue, amongst many things that I disliked about Kaepernick's protest once upon a time, is he really wasn't asking for anything. He was just saying, like, well, you know, like, we need accountability, you know, America's racist, blah, blah, blah. He didn't actually ask for a solution to redress the problem that he was saying was a real thing. So I appreciate the fact that the truckers have said, look, scrap the mandates. We're done going on with all of these restrictions and having to follow all these rules. So they've made their demands very plain to the government. But I
Right.
think we're kind of at this crossroads now where it seems like one of the two sides is going to have to escalate their tactics if they want to push this farther. I think
Exactly.
that the freedom truckers, if they want to continue to stay the course, as Josh said, are going to have to continue to unleash real economic consequences on the population. And if the government wants to end this quickly, they're going to have to probably use force at this point to do it. And we saw them clear out the Ambassador Bridge between Canada and Detroit
Right.
over the weekend. And I mean, y'all saw the footage when we opened the show. Like, some of that stuff is pretty foreboding. And to think that that would happen in Canada, you know, what's perceived to be like a relatively free and mild-mannered country.
Yeah.
It's crazy that we're at this point, but that's the effectiveness of the protest.
So David Marcus over at Fox was writing on this, and this was, come on, Fox, date your stuff. It was 2 days ago. And Marcus made a fantastic observation. One of the differences between the Canada protests and what you had going on in the U.S. with the essentially leftist protests predating all of this, the leftist protests attracted sort of unemployed people, ne'er-do-wells, furries, the sorts of people who actually have time to go engage in protests like that. So it didn't actually cost the economy just that much. There wasn't a lot of productive labor that was being stopped and redirected. Whereas when you have a group of truckers who work nonstop and who are essentially, I mean, they really are kind of the lifeblood of the economy. I mean,
Yeah.
the interstates and highways spread out like a series of veins and capillaries through the country. You really feel it when those guys stop pulling their weight. And that really should be, there's almost a Randian kind of striker element in this that really should terrify the powers that be.
Right.
This is just a few truckers. This is a drop in the bucket compared to the people who are actually ticked off over this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, at what point though, because we are seeing consequences obviously from the convoy, especially the auto industry up north is really starting to feel the effects after just about a week. They're facing about almost, let's see, what's the number? 988 million in
Oh,
losses.
is that all?
So this has big impacts. So how do you guys think it's realistic though, to play devil's advocate a little bit, of keeping the ideas and the convoy itself kind of unified enough that once their demands are satisfied in a peaceful, reasonable way, to keep then there's always, you know, the scare of the fringe element of, you know, those truckers that are just going to be like, nah, we're going to
This is my thing now.
This is my thing.
Yeah.
And I just am going to keep the disruption going no matter what. How do you stop that? Because that's always the danger of any protest, even the most peaceful protest.
So just super quickly, I really want to hear what you say on this, Caleb, but just off the top of my head, I think one massive difference here is that most of these truckers seem to have families and actually real life commitments that are going to draw them back. Whereas the fringe leftist groups, they don't really have anywhere to go afterward. This is kind of their reason debt. I mean, that's why they exist. It's what they live for. It's what the Bolsheviks lived for. It's why they existed. So, I think the fringe is protesting in the way you're talking about is super attractive to the leftist fringe.
Right.
There are fringe elements on the right, of course, but
always. There's always fringes on every side.
Most of these folks seem like they've probably got bills to pay.
Yeah. Caleb, what do you think?
It's freezing right now in Canada.
Fair point.
Do you think they really want to be sitting in the cabs of their trucks day after day, basically shivering under these conditions? Absolutely not. Josh is right. They have lives to go back to. They have money that they're leaving on the table by making this move.
Yeah.
So I think every motivating factor to them is let us go back to our regular lives. And the way that they see that being accomplished is by having their very simple, straightforward demands met. But I also think it's important just to acknowledge that, and we've talked about this in our publications and I'm sure on the show, that so much of the mainstream media coverage has focused on the small fringe elements of the trucker movement.
Of course.
Because there's tens of thousands of these guys, as far as we know, that are there. And then as soon as one of them does something that's, terrible, and we're not going to wallpaper over that, all of a sudden this person's actions apply to the movement more broadly.
Right.
So this smear campaign's been going on for weeks.
It's interesting. Guys, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember any stories about truckers doing anything just absolutely off the wall. And I completely could have missed it, folks, but
The only thing that I think was highlighted was that there may have been a swastika flag somewhere in Ottawa.
Yeah, and
I
there
know
was a Confederate flag,
And a
and then they
Confederate
said
flag.
somebody,
which is a swastika flag to these people.
Right.
which
Right.
Clearly, it's not. It
and,
means
and they
something
said
totally
somebody
different.
defaced a war monument as well.
Yeah.
Which
so
is-
the thing that the left lives to do. Well, they've got something in common with the left. Then
There we
Maybe
go.
there's some unity
We
there.
should be championing it then. But okay, then contrasting the Freedom Convoy, to the protest that happened as the result of George Floyd's death. We have two ends of the spectrum. You've got the truckers' convoy that has remained peaceful. People have praised it for remaining peaceful and clear with with the demands and the hopes. Swinging to the other side, you have George Floyd's death, which, as we all know, erupted across the states. It caused millions in damages in every city. People died. One of my favorite headlines from about 2 weeks in was, Forbes ran this. 14 days of protesting, 19 dead. Horribly violent protests. So, Caleb, talk to me about what is the biggest differences besides, we've talked about those being more leftist protests, but what is kind of the danger in more aimless protesting or these protests that are much less specific in what they're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, I think when you're able to have a clear vision and solidarity, then you're able to more or less keep the disparate threads of your movement together. Because what was a very clear sentiment in 2020 over the summer was rage.
Right.
Was absolute anger that people were looking to carry out. And it's not that other protests haven't had anger as a component of their movements as well, even peaceful ones. But the thing I respected about historically some of the most successful peaceful protests was this ability to, for the most part, keep people in line.
Right.
Because
That's good.
so much
That's
of
good.
what you're trying to achieve, you undercut your message if you behave just as badly as the people that you're protesting against.
Right.
So when CNN would go on and say, wow, this is like the second civil rights movement, and yet we see buildings burning, people bleeding in the streets, cops being wheeled off to the hospital, all of us were sitting there at home saying, I'm not so sure I believe what you're saying here.
Right.
So I think so much of it is the actions speak for themselves, and so much of your credibility is tied up in how you behave. So that's the piece of it that the truckers have succeeded in, and that was the bit that the BLM riots were, that defined it, was just the chaos and the unpredictability.
Right.
Well, I agree. I think I agree with everything you said. And people aren't stupid. They're able to watch the coverage of a bunch of 18-wheelers with Canada flags hanging off of them and people with their kids there and this kind of almost Tea Party-ish celebration atmosphere. There's a little more of a sense of urgency in Canada.
Yeah.
But that versus the mostly peaceful riots where, flames are up in the background and minority businesses are burning, set on fire strangely by minorities, or seemingly more often by people who are not minorities who say they're for the minorities. That's a really weird one. Actually, not that weird when you think about it. So, just people aren't stupid. When you look at the news coverage, as much as the news would love to twist the Canada thing into an evil, violent event, people aren't stupid. They see the difference.
Right. I think it's so clear. And, the benchmark for any sort of protest has always been Martin Luther King Jr. The father of the civil rights movement, but was adamant about the protesting being peaceful because rationally, he continually said that, violence can bring small victories, but they're only temporary and they're not lasting, and it's just not effective. 9 times out of 10 or 10 times out of 10, it's going to give you a worse reputation for the cause that you're fighting for if it's violent. And he was always an advocate for trying to first persuade people through word and speaking, and then his version of action was to peaceful action. You still take physical action, just not burning and killing people.
And unleash economic consequences too. It's not like all of Martin's movements didn't affect people's businesses and livelihoods. They did.
Right. And that's that's the fine line of protesting, though. Even peaceful and effective protest, when does it become, because so many protests are going to affect oftentimes your lowest common denominator,
Sure.
the poorest of the poor people, the ones who are the worst off. Protests, especially economic ones, are going to hurt those people more than anybody else. And so when can you justify that? When is the cause worthy enough to justify hurting the people who are already hurt?
Yeah. Well, I think at least one of the questions you've got to ask is the present state worse than the state that will be induced by protesting the present state? So if things are bad now, but by protesting them, I'm going to make it way worse and way worse for a long time, I'm not sure that's a good decision. If things are bad now, but they're going to get way, way worse if somebody doesn't stand up, that's when you need to stand up. And before the truckers really got going, I'm not sure there were any real signs that COVID mass hysteria was actually beginning to wane. Once they started going, I can't remember, did Boris Johnson, I can't remember if he began rescinding things before or after the truckers showed up.
It's right in that time.
It was after.
Almost simultaneous.
I think it was after. But these guys are right. I mean, it's been 2.5 years. That's probably also a question you need to look at. How long has the circumstance I'm protesting, how long has it persisted?
Right.
We can handle anything for a little bit. At least those of us in the middle class and the upper class. But you're right. The poorest people out there, they have the least margin. They are the most vulnerable. It is most likely that the utopian machinations of the left and the consequences of their foolishness will hurt the poorest people the most.
Right. Caleb, you have some good background with kind of more history of some of successful peaceful protest. So can you shine some light for us on how those were carried out? You know, we see Gandhi, we see Martin Luther King Jr., various human rights that were rightfully protesting and campaigned for, but how were those carried out successfully without, wreaking absolute havoc on vulnerable classes?
So the two you mentioned, I think, are great. I'm definitely going to touch on them. The other one that I think is really instructive is the women's suffrage movement that Alice Paul led in the back end of World War I. I mean, those women were the first people ever to protest outside the White House. And they were out there every single day for 18 months. Can you believe that? But the thing about those three protests with Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Alice Paul's women, they were defined by three key factors in my view. And that was the realistic demand, like I mentioned at the beginning, but also visibility and persistence. I think those are all key components of how something like this works successfully. But a peaceful protest, like I've mentioned, will unleash economic problems. Alice Paul leading those women to stand outside the White House, a lot of them were professionals, and when they left their jobs and got locked up, there were economic problems.
Right.
When Gandhi told the people in India to boycott British salt in a country where there was no refrigeration, that turned the entire meat industry on its head because salt was vital to those folks.
Right.
So that was a huge economic consequence. Martin, when he did the bus boycott in Alabama, a lot of people had, their jobs laid off and they had pay cuts because if they worked in the busing and all of a sudden nobody's riding the buses anymore, they're paying a price. But I think the fundamental question you have to ask in this conversation is the goal of any protest is to convince the larger population you're right and to get them on your side.
Right.
So if you're going to escalate the tactics and if you're going to unleash economic problems, I think the biggest thing you have to realize is the population with you or not?
Yes.
Are they willing to suffer the pain to achieve this goal? And I'm not sure if the Canadian population is 100% willing to take this to the next level with the Freedom Convoy. I think if they are, there's no way that they can lose. Because if economic problems happen, the situation will get more dire, and I would say the government probably caves. If the government has an aggressive response and does their own Canadian version of Tiananmen Square, I think if the country's already placed its heart behind the protests and it said, we're willing to suffer with you, I think the government also loses in that instance. So I think that's the big point you have to make. You've got to address the people that are going to suffer and make sure they're willing to go through it.
Right. Do you think that, the idea of then having the population behind you, do you think that's one reason perhaps the BLM riots and protests were unsuccessful? Well, it depends on how you measure success. Because so many people eventually, whether they officially condemned it or not, a lot of the riots just kind of died out. And nothing really changed, except that our police force is much worse off and crime is much, much higher.
People have black squares on their Instagrams now.
Right. And people will have flags of Black Lives Matter, but not a whole lot has actually changed outside of the rhetoric.
So to your point earlier about the poor getting hit the hardest, you're right. Not much has changed for us sitting at this table. But if you live in Cabrini Green in Chicago, that one lone police car that might pay you a visit once a day to try to keep crime down may not be there anymore.
That's a great point.
So it did accomplish something, and it accomplished what they said they wanted to accomplish. They got rid of police, and we saw how that played out.
Right.
So it didn't. That's the cruel joke about all of this.
Yeah.
Is that for those of us in the middle class and for the folks who are in the upper class, most of this doesn't mean much of anything. The people who were hurt by this are the people who need help the most. And by the way, they're being betrayed. Those poor people are being betrayed by the people they voted for.
Well, exactly.
To protect them.
Exactly. So do you think that the whole pretense then of Black Lives Matter, the black population is suppressed, but then the only thing that the protests got was a worse police force, do you think then that the American society's perception of injustice against black people is just that it's not that bad? Because what did not happen was it was not like the civil rights movement where it was like, we're going to make sure that legislation and laws and that, jobs are better for black people. None of that happened. There has been no job growth. There has been no sort of any other civil growth for the black population other than that they're less policed.
Well, yeah, and I think it's super hard to change minds to appeal to people's morality when you are talking against the background of burning businesses and bricks being thrown. That is one thing. If the video shows that, that's one thing. If the video, however, shows a bunch of people dressed in their Sunday clothes walking down a street and then having fire hoses turned on them by the powers that be, that can change some minds. And that's what ultimately won with the civil rights movement. And so that's what's so sad is Dr. King he is clearly now an artifact of the past for the race baiters who are out there now.
Absolutely.
He has to be considered a fool or an Uncle Tom, though they won't say it out loud yet. Yet that's what would accomplish the most good, and that's what did accomplish the most good.
Right. Yeah. Sadly, MLK is no longer woke enough or black enough.
Yeah. So I guess I say that to answer your question. I don't think the protest did any good at all as far as making people more sympathetic to the plight of poor urban black people.
Yeah.
I think it hurt them immensely. And there's no coincidence that it was a bunch of woke white people who were out there throwing bricks.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the most valuable things is to always, trace protests back, 5-6 steps further to who's really behind them, who's really pushing the rhetoric, and a lot of times it's old white men.
Look at who was out during the day for the George Floyd protests. Those were black people, and who was out at night throwing bricks. Well, there were
white
some
people.
black people, but I saw more white people.
Yeah, I was in Portland while it was happening. Yeah.
Oh,
I saw it happen every day.
You were in Portland?
Yeah, while this was all going down. When I moved to
How
Portland
many
a couple
bricks
years,
did you throw?
myself personally, none. Our business was looted. My friends' cars were broken into. We had
not
people
know this?
constantly that were living in the vehicles that we had on the lot that I was working at.
I did not know this.
I literally saw the thing fall apart in front of my eyes. But the thing you're describing, this social justice thing in daylight and this anarchy at nighttime, was what happened for months. And when the population sees that, it just rattles their cage because it kind of makes everything feel like it's coming unglued.
Yeah. And if you are black and you feel oppressed and you're wanting legit change, how frustrating does it have to be to go out and protest during the day and then go home, and then turn on the news and see a bunch of idiot woke white people hijacking what you're trying to do and burning stuff to the ground.
Yeah, Oregon and Portland is one of the whitest places in the country.
Yeah,
Yes.
90-something
This was where they all of a sudden decided to make their stand for
like,
Black
I
Lives
don't
Matter.
think so. Yeah.
No, I think it was an excuse for a lot of these people to just misbehave because they were frustrated and bored and angry.
Right.
But you talk about the
Well-
damage that this has inflicted. I think just more broadly, it's given protest a bad name.
It's
like
absolutely
one of the first pieces you wrote for me when you first started here that is still one of my favorites to this day is you wrote a piece about protest. And it was a video contrast showing BLM protesters against anti-lockdown protesters.
Yeah,
And in the
completely
video,
different.
it showed like outside Portland, they're just ripping the fence down in the courthouse. And then I
Right.
think the other clip was from Australia, and they knock a fence over. They literally pick it back
They
up.
pick it back up, and they're like, "Oh, sorry."
So our country has a rich history of protest. Like we've been protesting since the Boston Tea Party.
Right.
But the BLM riots have given this practice that I think is vital and actually good for the country a terrible reputation.
So, but they're 100% predictable because of where they're coming from. You said just a second ago that some of this was an excuse for people to misbehave. And for a few people, I think you're probably right. There's always going to be that group. But when you look at the aims and objectives of the people who are out there really raising hell, I
Right.
mean,
The
these are
ringleaders.
neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist, and
Yes.
they are behaving. I'm going for a record for how many times you can use the word Bolshevik in a series of podcasts. They are doing exactly what the Bolsheviks were doing. And that's that's no coincidence. That is the plan. That is rules for radicals. That is make them pay. That is try to flip. That's try to foment revolt.
Yeah,
Exactly.
absolutely. And I think that's really, truly what scared people. And
Yeah.
when I left Portland, like a year or so ago, the city hadn't bounced back. I still don't think it's bounced back.
Yeah, and make no mistake, the people who are involved in this and the academics who are pushing it and rolling out the intellectual drivel that backs it up, they want 1917. They want the Bolsheviks in the streets.
Right.
And they want to be, they consider all the rest of us, the bourgeois, they want us dead, and then they want to take our places as the leaders of the country.
And
That's
once
what
they
want.
and
the
once they
culture.
take place and once they take our places, they'll outlaw protest.
Oh yeah, we'll crush it with an iron fist. And then you mentioned
Exactly.
Tiananmen, it will be Tiananmen. You stand up and they will roll a tank over you.
Yeah, because everyone can recognize that protests have often been how things get done in society. It's how some of the greatest wrongs have been righted throughout, especially the past 2 centuries, is through protest. But what no one wants to recognize is it's not just protest in general. It's a type of protest. It is how you go about doing it and what your goals and aims are.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, then you just have pure chaos. You have then you scare society as they see things become unglued. And then it's unproductive.
So there's one other thing worth mentioning in this. It is right that the death of George Floyd appears to have been needless and tragic.
Yes,
Without question.
without question.
And we have had several instances where you have seen black people killed at the hands of police. But when you look at the data, the Black Lives Matter crowd is more like the police are bad crowd. When you look at the data, the overwhelming number of needless black deaths come from the hands of murders come from the hands of other black people. That is tragic. And if the woke crew out there actually cared about black lives, that would be what they're talking about. I think the stat for 2019 was, when you actually boiled it all down, I think it was 4 unarmed black people were killed by police
In a country of 330-some million people.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you look at that and then you look at the response, it's clearly disproportionate, and disproportionate things don't happen without a reason. So the question needs to be, who's behind that and what are their goals? The goals are not to help black people, clearly, because they would be focused other places.
Clearly.
Doesn't mean they'd be ignoring black deaths at the hands of police. I mean, they'd be ignoring it. But it does mean they would be talking about other things. And if you try to ask about those other things, they immediately change the subject or refuse to answer.
Absolutely. Goals of protest are often reached. It's just a lot of protests have bad goals.
Yeah, that's
a great
not
way to
bad.
put it.
Yeah, in some ways, the BLM protest goals were completely met if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement as, oh, they were trying to, just wreak havoc and chaos and tear society apart in order to put, new people in power. They actually did pretty much accomplish that.
So here's a question, and I know we're running over time, and I'm not in the middle chair, but I still have to ask it. Dr. King, part of the reason Dr. King, his approach worked was because there was incredible racism, and people were willing to turn fire hoses on black people who were simply walking down the street trying to draw attention to a cause they were concerned about.
There was societal racism. I think that's
there was an enormous amount.
Yeah.
Now there will always be racism. That's a different discussion. But anyway, so would Dr. King's methods work today? I think they're not engaging in them because a group of well-dressed black people can walk down just about any street in the United States now, not everyone, but in the United States, and be welcomed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somehow nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about that. Why is it that Dr. King's approach isn't being used? Well, we've moved past that time.
We moved past that time. And also, Dr. King's
made progress.
I would say his protest tactics are being used, but they are not being used for racial protests anymore. I think the Freedom Convoy is using.
Great point. Great point.
Is using MLK-like tactics of peaceful, clear, purposeful protest.
Yep.
It's just no longer in the racial theater.
Yep.
Anyways, all right. Now we're running over time,
discussion.
so that's all we got for you today. Thank you so much for joining us. We are here every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you want to hear more of these great discussions and great takes, make sure to subscribe to us on Rumble and YouTube. And hit the it's a little bell, right? Yeah. Little bell to make sure that you're notified that when we go live so that you never miss our hot, brilliant takes here. So, from all of us at the Western Journal, have a great Thursday. We'll see you on Friday.